You know how every small town has that one story people whisper about but never say out loud? Well, in the summer of 1991, a 12-year-old girl vanished from a lakeside camp in northern Michigan. And to this day, nobody knows what really happened to her. If you think you've heard every missing person case, think again. This one? It's different. Stick around, because by the time you hear what the police found weeks later, you'll be rethinking everything you thought you knew about safe places. And before we go any deeper, hit that subscribe button, because we dig into the stories they'd rather you forget. It was the 14th of July, 1991, a warm Sunday afternoon, the kind where the air smells like pine trees and grilled hot dogs. The campers at Clearwater Lake Camp were just finishing lunch when the counselors announced free swim down at the dock. The place looked like a postcard cabins painted deep brown, a wooden mess hall, and the shimmering lake stretching so far you couldn't see the other side. The camp had been running since the 1950s, and nothing bad had ever happened here. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. That summer, 12-year-old Emily Vaughn had been there for just over a week. She was shy, kept to herself mostly, and had a habit of sketching in a small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. She was the kind of kid you might not notice at first, but once you did, you couldn't help but like her. Her bunkmates later said she had this quiet way of making people laugh without even trying. The last time anyone saw Emily was at 1:12 p.m., walking barefoot from her cabin toward the path that led down to the lake. A counselor named Denise remembered calling after her, "Don't forget your towel," and Emily just waved without turning around. She never showed up to swim. At first, nobody panicked. Kids wandered off all the time at camp, usually to the rec hall or the art room. But when the dinner bell rang at 5 o'clock and Emily still hadn't been seen, the mood shifted. By 5:15, counselors were searching the cabins. By 5:30, the head of the camp was on the phone with the local sheriff's office. It wasn't long before the rumors started. Some kids whispered she'd run away. Others swore they'd seen a strange boat on the lake earlier that day. One camper claimed they'd heard Emily arguing with an older boy near the canoes. The official search began at sunrise the next morning. Deputies, search dogs, and even a dive team combed the lake and surrounding woods. They found nothing, no shoe prints, no scraps of clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she'd just evaporated. Here's where it gets strange. 2 days after Emily vanished, the camp received a postcard addressed to her. No return address. Just 4 words written in all capital letters. "Meet me by the waterfall." The problem? There was no waterfall anywhere near Clearwater Lake. Sheriff's deputies traced the postmark. It had been mailed from a small town 60 miles away, the day before Emily disappeared. That's when investigators started digging deeper into her life back home. Emily's parents, Mark and Lisa Vaughn, lived in a modest white house on the outskirts of Lansing. Her father was a mechanic. Her mother worked part-time at a diner. They told police Emily had never run away before, never mentioned meeting anyone, and had been excited about camp. But when detectives searched her bedroom, they found something that made their stomachs drop: a folded-up map tucked into her sketchbook. It wasn't a normal map. It was hand-drawn, with little landmarks labeled in Emily's handwriting: Big Rock, Hollow Tree, and in the corner, Falls. The only problem? The area drawn on the map didn't match anywhere near the camp. By the end of that week, the sheriff's office had a theory Emily had been lured away, possibly by someone she knew, and that map was a clue. But there was no evidence, no witnesses, and no ransom note. The case went cold fast. For most people, that's where the story ends. But if you talk to anyone who was at Clearwater Lake Camp that summer, they'll tell you there's another side to it, one the official reports leave out entirely. A side that involves late-night sightings, missing camp records, and a rumor about an abandoned cabin deep in the woods that wasn't on any of the camp's maps. And that's exactly where we're headed next. By the third morning, Clearwater Lake Camp didn't feel like a camp anymore. The laughter was gone. The chatter at breakfast was replaced by the scrape of spoons on cereal bowls and the occasional burst of static from a deputy's walkie-talkie. Sheriff Don Harris, a stocky man with a trimmed mustache, had turned the camp office into a command post. He'd worked his share of missing persons cases, but never one involving a child who'd seemingly vanished in broad daylight. His first move was to lock down the camp, no one in, no one out, unless cleared by deputies. They started with the water. Clearwater Lake was big, 3 miles across, ringed by forest. The dive team searched the dock area, then fanned out toward the deeper sections. The water was murky, choked with reeds. Divers surfaced shaking their heads. No sign of Emily. Not a sandal. Not her towel. The search expanded. Teams checked every trail, every cabin, even the maintenance sheds. A K-9 unit was brought in. The dogs picked up a scent near the main dock, followed it along the shore, then lost it abruptly in a patch of trampled grass. Some deputies thought that meant Emily had entered the water. Others believed it was where she might have gotten into a boat. On day 4, Sheriff Harris did something that would change the course of the investigation. He brought in a criminal profiler from the state capitol. Her name was Dr. Karen Ellison, and she had a reputation for spotting patterns other investigators missed. Ellison read through every statement from campers and staff. She flagged one almost immediately. A 14-year-old boy named Tyler, in the cabin closest to the lake, told deputies he'd seen a man in a red baseball cap sitting alone in a canoe earlier that day. Tyler said the man wasn't fishing, just watching. He thought it was weird enough to remember, but not enough to mention until asked directly. The camp director insisted no one fitting that description was on staff, and no visitors were scheduled. Meanwhile, the postcard that had arrived for Emily, the one about the waterfall, had become the centerpiece of the investigation. Detectives examined it under a magnifying lamp. The handwriting was blocky, uneven. The paper was the kind sold in cheap tourist racks at gas stations. The front showed a generic lake scene, not Clearwater Lake. The postmark was from Elkford, a small logging town 60 miles northwest. Sheriff Harris sent 2 deputies to canvass the area. Most residents hadn't heard of Emily's disappearance. But at the Cedar Lodge Motel, the owner remembered a tall man in a red cap, checking in 2 nights before she went missing. Paid cash. Stayed one night. Gave the name John Miller. No ID. Back at the camp, tension was boiling over. Parents arrived to pull their kids out. Reporters camped outside the gate, shoving microphones toward anyone who would speak. The Vaughns stayed on site, sleeping in the nurse's cabin, waiting for news that never came. Lisa Vaughn, Emily's mother, told deputies something that hadn't been in her first statement. 2 weeks before camp, Emily had received a phone call at home. The caller was a man, and when Lisa picked up the extension, he hung up. Emily claimed it was a wrong number, but Lisa wasn't convinced. The phone company was able to trace the call to a payphone outside a grocery store in Elkford. By day 7, the official search wound down, not because they'd given up, but because the trail had gone cold. The wooded area around the camp had been searched 3 times. The lake had been dragged twice. Deputies had interviewed every staff member, camper, and delivery driver that had entered the property that week. But Emily was still gone. For most people, the story ended here, a tragic mystery filed away in a dusty box at the sheriff's office. But for those who were there, the next thing that happened burned itself into their memories. Because on the 8th day, a local fisherman found something floating near the far side of the lake, something that would send the investigation in an entirely new direction. The fisherman's name was Henry Cole, 58 years old, born and raised in the area. He'd been out on the far side of Clearwater Lake early that morning, his aluminum boat rocking gently in the water. Henry had been casting for bass near the tree line when something bright caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a piece of trash, maybe a plastic bag blown in from camp. But as his boat drifted closer, he He saw it wasn't trash. It was fabric, bright blue. He leaned over the side, hooked it with his paddle, and lifted it into the boat. It was a girl's windbreaker. Thin, nylon, the kind sold in department stores in the early 1990s. On the inside collar, in black marker, someone had written, Eva. Henry didn't waste time. He reeled in his line, started the outboard, and headed straight to the camp's dock. When Sheriff Harris got a look at the jacket, he didn't need confirmation from the Vaughns. He knew it was Emily's. Lisa Vaughn still asked to hold it. She gripped the damp fabric so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The jacket was sent to the state crime lab. Investigators hoped they'd find hair, fibers, maybe even blood. But this was 1991. DNA testing wasn't the quick, precise science it is today. It could take months for results, and even then, there was no guarantee. The discovery reignited the search. If the jacket had drifted from somewhere else on the lake, the current could give them a clue about where it entered the water. State police brought in a hydrologist who studied lake patterns. His conclusion: the jacket most likely came from the mouth of a small inlet on the northern shore, an area thick with cattails and almost inaccessible by foot. Harris organized a sweep of the inlet. Deputies slogged through waist-deep water, pushing aside reeds taller than a man. About 50 yards in, they found a rotting wooden dock, half collapsed into the mud. It wasn't marked on any camp maps, and when they asked the director, he swore he'd never seen it before. The dock looked old weather-gray planks, nails rusted to orange dust. But one section of the board seemed newer, lighter in color. A deputy pried it up and found a small plastic tackle box wedged between the beams. Inside was nothing but a few rusty hooks, some tangled fishing line, and a torn corner of notebook paper. The paper had a single word scrawled in pencil: Falls. When Harris brought the evidence back to the Vaughns, Lisa immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Emily's C. The paper matched the style and size of the pages in her sketchbook. The waterfall clue suddenly seemed less like a taunt and more like a breadcrumb. But there was still the same problem: no one knew of any waterfall within miles of the camp. That's when Harris decided to expand the search perimeter far beyond Clearwater Lake. He pulled county maps going back to the 1940s, searching for any old water features, creeks, or collapsed mill sites that might match the description. One of the oldest maps showed something promising: a small tributary about 4 miles northwest of the camp, marked simply as Falls Creek. According to the map, it ran through what was now private property, land owned by an out-of-state timber company. On day 9, Harris got permission to search it. The creek was narrow, winding through thick forest. The waterfall turned out to be more of a steep rock shelf with water trickling over it, maybe 6 feet high. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, but to a 12-year-old, it might have seemed magical. Near the base of the rocks, deputies found something half buried in the mud, a piece of red plastic shaped like a whistle. The camp director confirmed each camper was issued a whistle on a lanyard for emergencies. The whistle was caked in dirt, the cord frayed and broken. The Vaughns couldn't say for sure it was Emily's, but Lisa kept it anyway. The press was relentless now. News vans lined the road leading to camp. The story made the front page of the Lansing State Journal, then got picked up by a regional television station. Interviews with locals revealed more fragments. A woman swore she'd seen a tall man in a red cap at a gas station near Elkford 2 days before the disappearance. Another resident claimed they'd spotted a small, pale blue rowboat pulled up along the northern shore late on the day Emily vanished. Harris tried to keep a tight lid on these details, but rumors have a way of spreading faster than facts. By the end of week 2, the sheriff admitted something to himself. They were no longer looking for a lost camper. They were looking for the victim of an abduction. And just when he was beginning to think they'd run out of leads, a phone call came into the station that changed everything. It wasn't from a local. It wasn't from anyone who'd even been to Clearwater Lake. It was from a truck driver passing through northern Michigan who claimed he'd given a ride to a young girl matching Emily's description on the night of the 14th of July. The truck driver's name was Carl Bennett, 42 years old, hauling lumber from Minnesota to Ohio. His voice on the phone was steady, but there was something in it, a kind of hesitation, like he wasn't sure if calling was the right move. Carl told the deputy who answered that on the night of July 14th, the same day Emily disappeared, he had stopped at a roadside diner just off Route 27, about 30 miles south of Clearwater Lake. It was after dark, maybe 9:30. He'd been sitting at the counter drinking coffee when the bell over the door jingled. In walked a man wearing a red baseball cap and a young girl. She was small, thin, with light brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her clothes didn't fit quite right, like they belonged to someone older. Carl remembered thinking the pair didn't look related. The man barely spoke to her. He ordered a slice of pie for himself, nothing for her. She sat 2 stools down from him, staring at the napkin dispenser like she was somewhere else in her head. After about 10 minutes, the man got up, paid in cash, and walked out, leaving the girl behind. That's when Carl says she slid off her stool and walked over to him. "She asked me," Carl said, his voice low, "Are you going east?" Carl told her yes. He assumed she needed a ride, maybe to meet family. She didn't offer much else. Said her name was Emily, just Emily, and that she needed to get away from here. Before Carl could ask more, the man in the red cap came back in, grabbed her by the arm, and led her out the door. She didn't scream. She didn't even look back. Carl had convinced himself it was just a family argument, maybe a father and daughter having a rough night. But when he saw Emily's picture on the news over a week later, he felt sick. Sheriff Harris didn't waste time. He sent 2 deputies to track down the waitress who'd been working the counter that night. Her name was Joy Martinez, and she remembered the man and the girl instantly. "They didn't match," Joy said. "You know how you can just tell?" She was nervous. He was, I don't know, watching her, like he was worried she'd bolt. Joy also remembered the man had paid with 2 crumpled 20s and told her to keep the change. She'd written his order down on a yellow ticket still in the trash when deputies checked. The paper was smeared with coffee stains, but the handwriting was there. State police analyzed it alongside the postcard sent to Emily at camp. The slant of the letters, the shape of the M they matched. Now they had something they'd been missing since day one. A connection between the postcard, the red cap man, and a live sighting of Emily after she disappeared. But there was still a problem. The man had left in a vehicle nobody could clearly describe. Carl thought it might have been a pale blue pickup. Joy thought it was a dark sedan. By the time deputies pulled security footage from the gas station across the street, the tapes had already been recorded over. The trail went cold again, until the Vaughns got an anonymous letter in the mail. It arrived in a plain white envelope, with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in Wisconsin, dated 11 days after Emily vanished. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper with 5 words written in shaky block letters. "Stop looking or you'll regret it." The handwriting didn't match Emily's or the postcard. This was someone else. Someone who knew enough about the case to rattle the family and possibly derail the investigation. Harris had seen threats like this before. Sometimes they were from actual suspects, meant to scare people off. Other times they were cruel hoaxes. Either way, he knew the clock was ticking. He doubled down on Elkford, believing the answer was somewhere in that small town, the red cap man, the motel stay, the payphone call, and now a possible escape route out of state. Deputies re-interviewed every gas station attendant, every diner waitress, every late-night clerk. A clerk at a bait shop thought he might have seen the red cap man buying fishing line and a small rowboat anchor just days before Emily vanished. He couldn't remember the exact date, but he did remember the man's hands. They were scratched up, the clerk said, like he'd been in the woods or fighting something. By the end of week 3, the case had shifted from a search and rescue to a full-blown interstate manhunt. The Vaughns went on local television, pleading for their daughter's safe return. Lisa spoke directly to the camera. "If you have her, please, just let her come home. She's only 12. She hasn't lived yet. Please don't take that from her." Her voice cracked on the word 12. But just when it seemed like the trail was about to go cold for good, a logging crew working 15 miles north of Elkford stumbled on something in the woods. Something that would change everything about what investigators thought they knew. It was August 3rd, exactly 20 days since Emily had vanished. The logging crew had been clearing a stretch of forest owned by the timber company, just off an old service road north of Elkford. It was the kind of road no one used anymore, overgrown with grass in the middle and potholes deep enough to swallow a hubcap. Around mid-morning, one of the workers, a man named Dave Kershaw, spotted something odd near the base of a pine tree. At first, he thought it was just a pile of trash, a tarp half covered in leaves. But when he pulled it back, he froze. Underneath was a small blue duffel bag, faded and damp. It was zipped shut. Dave didn't open it. Something about the way it was sitting there felt wrong. He waved over his foreman, who called the sheriff's office. The old Elkford mill sat at the end of a dirt road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The windows were smashed out years ago, the front doors hanging from rusted hinges. Even in daylight, it looked like the kind of place you'd cross the street to avoid. Sheriff Harris, 2 deputies, and the retired forest ranger Bill Matson approached from the south side, stepping over piles of splintered wood and broken glass. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mold and old oil. The first floor was empty, just rotting beams, an overturned filing cabinet, and a scattering of beer cans. But near the back, Harris noticed something strange. One section of the concrete floor was covered with a large sheet of plywood weighed down with cinder blocks. They moved the blocks and pried up the board. Beneath it was a narrow opening, a set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The basement was colder, the air damp. Flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a maze of old machinery, belts, and conveyor shafts. In the far corner, behind a leaning steel cabinet, was a makeshift room. Someone had nailed up plywood walls, leaving a single doorway covered by a torn blanket. Inside were 2 metal folding chairs, a stained mattress on the floor, and an old kerosene lantern. Against one wall sat a small plastic crate filled with food wrappers, granola bars, canned beans, empty soda bottles. And then they saw it. On the mattress was a camp-issued blanket, the same style every camper at Clearwater Lake used. It was dirty, but the faded green pattern was unmistakable. One of the deputies checked the crate. Under the trash was a plastic whistle identical to the one found at Falls Creek. This one was still on its cord. The walls of the makeshift room were covered in drawings, crude sketches done in pencil on lined paper. Most were of the lake, the woods, or the old mill itself, but several were of a young girl, always from the side, never facing the viewer. Harris felt the weight of the silence pressing in. Whoever had been here had lived in this basement recently, maybe even within the last few days. The food wrappers weren't moldy. The soda bottles were still sticky. They swept the rest of the mill and found the rear exit, a door that opened onto a narrow trail leading into the forest. Fresh footprints were visible in the dirt. The prints led north, toward a stretch of marshland that eventually connected to the same inlet where Emily's jacket had been found. For Harris, it clicked. The red-capped man knew the area well enough to use the lake and its hidden paths like a web. He could move between locations without ever touching the main roads. The scene was photographed, evidence bagged. The camp blanket, the whistle, the drawings, all of it was loaded into the sheriff's SUV. But Harris couldn't shake the feeling that they just missed him. That somewhere in those trees, the man in the red cap was watching them pack up his hideout. Back at the station, Harris spread the evidence across the conference table. The Vaughns were brought in once again. Lisa picked up one of the drawings from the mill, a sketch of a girl sitting on a dock, looking out over the water. She didn't need to ask who it was. "She's alive," Lisa said quietly. She was alive when he drew this. Harris wanted to believe her, but he knew time was running out. That night, a call came in from a hiker who'd been on a ridge trail about 5 miles north of the mill. She claimed she'd seen a man in a red baseball cap paddling a canoe along a narrow branch of the lake, and in front of him, a girl. The hiker had tried to shout, but they disappeared under the cover of the trees. Harris mobilized every available deputy, plus state police units. They launched boats, set up roadblocks, and pushed into the forest on foot. The searchlights from the patrol boats swept across the water, slicing through the dark. Somewhere out there, the red-capped man was moving, maybe toward another hideout, maybe toward something worse. When deputies arrived, they opened the bag. Inside were a pair of sneakers, size 5, caked with dried mud, a t-shirt with the Clearwater Lake Camp logo, a paperback book with Emily written on the inside cover, and at the very bottom a spiral sketchbook. The first few pages were water damaged, the pencil lines blurred, but deeper in, the drawings were clear. They were mostly simple landscapes, trees, the lake, a few animals, but the last page stopped everyone cold. It was a pencil sketch of a man in a baseball cap, sitting in a canoe, watching. Sheriff Harris didn't need to ask who Emily had drawn. The bag was sent to the state crime lab immediately. Harris ordered a full sweep of the area, not just the spot where it was found, but a quarter-mile in every direction. That's when they found something else. About 200 yards from the duffel, in a shallow depression covered by branches, lay the remains of a small fire pit. In the ashes were bits of melted plastic, a few rusty nails, and what looked like the charred remains of a shoe sole. Whoever had been there had tried to destroy something. The lab came back with mixed news. The sneakers and t-shirt were confirmed to be Emily's hair strands, inside matched hers. But the sketchbook? No usable fingerprints except Emily's own. They did, however, find fibers from a vehicle carpet clinging to the bottom of the duffel bag. Testing suggested they came from an older model Ford pickup, light blue in color. It was the first solid link between the bag, the suspect vehicle Carl Bennett had described, and the red-capped man. Now Harris had a clear picture in his head. Emily had been taken from camp, transported in that pickup, and at some point her belongings had been dumped in these woods. But why leave them there instead of destroying everything? Some deputies thought the suspect had been interrupted. Others believed it was intentional, a way to confuse the investigation, scattering clues across miles of wilderness. The Vaughns were brought in to see the items. Lisa broke down when she saw the sketchbook. Mark stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his jaw tight. "She drew him," Lisa whispered. She knew she was in danger. Harris had no choice. He went public with the sketch from Emily's notebook. Local television stations flashed it on the screen. Newspapers printed it on the front page. The description was simple. White male, late 30s to mid-40s, medium build, often seen wearing a red baseball cap, possibly driving a light blue Ford pickup. Older model. Within 24 hours, tips started flooding in. Most were dead-ends guys, in ball caps, spotted at gas stations, fishermen with similar boats. But one call, from a retired forest ranger named Bill Matson, stood out. Bill said the man in the sketch looked like someone he'd run off from a restricted part of the forest about 2 years earlier. He didn't know the name, but remembered the guy saying he lived out by the old mill. The old mill was a crumbling building on the outskirts of Elkford. It had been abandoned since the late 1970s, the walls covered in graffiti, the roof sagging. Teenagers used it for drinking on weekends, but otherwise it was forgotten. Harris sent a team to check it out. What they found inside would wipe away any lingering hope that Emily had simply run away. The manhunt began just after midnight. Sheriff Harris stood on the bow of a patrol boat, scanning the shoreline with a high-powered flashlight. The water was glassy, every ripple reflecting the beam like shattered silver. On the radio, a deputy's voice crackled. North Inlet team, we've got movement. Harris turned the boat hard. The engine roared as they sped toward the narrow channel that fed into the marshlands. Up ahead, in the dim glow of the searchlights, Harris caught sight of it, a pale blue canoe gliding silently through the reeds. In the back, a man wearing a red baseball cap was paddling hard. In the front, hunched low, was a small figure. "Emily!" Harris shouted across the water. The man twisted around. For a split second, their eyes met, and then he dug the paddle in deeper, turning the canoe toward the tree line. Two patrol boats closed in from opposite sides. The man's canoe scraped the mudbank, and he jumped out, dragging the girl with him. She stumbled in the shallow water, almost falling, but he yanked her upright and bolted into the woods. Harris and two deputies leapt from their boat and gave chase. The beam from Harris's flashlight bounced wildly as branches whipped across his arms. The man in the red cap was fast, but not fast enough. They caught him in a clearing, tackled him hard to the ground. The girl broke free and staggered toward Harris. She was thin, pale, her clothes damp and filthy. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. "Emily?" Harris asked. She nodded once, eyes wide. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "I want to go home." The man in the red cap was cuffed and hauled to his feet. He said nothing, just stared at Harris with a flat, cold expression. Deputies led Emily back to the boat. She wrapped herself in a blanket and clung to Lisa Vaughn's arms as soon as they reached shore. Mark stood beside them, his hand on the back of her head, his face buried in her hair. Later, in the interrogation room, the man finally spoke. His name wasn't John Miller, and he had no connection to the camp. He refused to say why he'd taken Emily, where he'd been keeping her, or if anyone else had been involved. But the evidence, the jacket, the duffel bag, the whistle, the drawings told its own story. Emily spent 3 days in the hospital. She didn't talk much about what happened in the 20 days she'd been gone. Some things she couldn't remember. Other things she didn't want to. The only detail she gave was about the first night, how she'd been walking to the lake when the man in the red cap appeared out of nowhere, telling her a counselor needed her by the boathouse. She'd followed him. And then, she was in the canoe. She never saw the camp again until the night Harris found her. The following summer, Clearwater Lake Camp shut down for good. The cabins were left to rot, the dock pulled up and burned. Locals say if you stand at the water's edge late at night, you can still hear the echo of a girl's whistle carried on the wind. Emily Vaughn's story faded from the headlines within a few months, but in northern Michigan, people never really stopped talking about it. For the Vaughns, life didn't just go back to normal. You don't go through 20 days of not knowing if your child is alive and simply move on. Emily grew older, but she carried those days with her, the shadows in the corners of her memory, the sound of water lapping against a canoe in the dark. The man in the red cap went to trial the following year. He was convicted on multiple charges, but he never explained why he took her. He never said what his plan was. Some believe he was waiting for the right moment to disappear with her for good. If the fisherman hadn't spotted that jacket, if the logging crew hadn't found the duffel bag, if the hiker hadn't made that call, the ending might have been very different. And maybe that's the hardest truth about this case sometimes. Survival comes down to a chain of chance encounters. One person's choice to look twice, one decision to make a phone call. The 1991 summer camp disappearance no one talks about could have ended as just another cold case buried in an evidence locker. Instead, it became a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, the missing can be found. If you want more stories like this, the ones they'd rather you forget, tap that subscribe button and watch the next video on your screen right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.